Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen, and with us for our program today, Assemblyman Mark Johns. Mark Johns represents the 135th Assembly District in New York State, an Assembly District that includes Monroe County. And we want to thank you folks in Monroe County for joining us for our program today. Mark Johns, nice to see you.
Good to be back.
We've got lots to get caught up on here. At the end of 2015, Albany shook with the convictions of two of its former legislative leaders, the Assembly Speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, both convicted by juries of crimes of corruption, of using their public position for personal gain.
Right.
That has overseen everything that's taken place so far in this 2016 legislative session. There's discussions of it in almost every bill that gets brought up on the Assembly or Senate floor. Let's talk a little bit about today about that, about changing the culture here at the state capitol. And I think what's interesting to me as I sit back and look at all the different discussions that are happening, there's an awful lot of differences of opinion as to how to accomplish this and fix this place up.
Well, what we need is real reform, not a good first step, as they always say. If I had $1 for every good first step we've seen in Albany, I'd be a multimillionaire, But if there's a problem, taking one step is really not the solution. We need to take all the steps, and that's what I've been advocating for my 3 terms that I've been up here.
Where to begin then? If Mark Johns was the supreme ruler of the New York State Legislature, where would you start?
Well, I think I'd do what the people ask us to do. They want, for instance, they want term limits on leadership positions, term limits overall. They want to get rid of gerrymandered districts. They want to have 2-year budget cycles, which would save us $5 or $10 million, just that alone. Possibly a unicameral legislature, which would get rid of 2/3 of the politicians down here, mostly career politicians, and would save us another $120 million a year that we could use for roads and bridges or schools to keep property taxes down. We're not down here to make life better for ourselves. We're not supposed to be. We're supposed to be down here to make life better for the people back home. And that's consistently what I've done for the 3 terms that I've been down here.
And you talk about the career politicians, what you had in the Assembly Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader that both got convicted. You had guys that were in these positions for 20 years plus.
Sure.
And they weren't, the juries convicted them of looking out more for themselves than for the people that they represent. That's a pretty sad state of affairs, and I think it's got a lot of New Yorkers looking rather askance at their state legislature.
Well, they should be, and I'll be honest with you, Sheldon Silver was down here for 40 years. 22 years he was the Speaker. And in the Assembly, it's top-down driven. The Speaker decides every bill that's going to come to the floor. Every bill that comes to the floor passes. I mean, we haven't had a bill come to the floor and fail in decades. And yet, we only vote on, at the most, 10% of the bills that we author. So 90% of the bills that we have out there are never going to come up for a vote, therefore never be able to become law.
You stood recently at a press conference here at the state capitol and called for a change in that very dynamic, calling for a change in which the Speaker can no longer control which bills come to the floor, in that if a bill has more than 76 sponsors, 150 members in the Assembly, folks.
Right.
So you divide that in half at 75. You need 75 plus 1 or 76 to pass a bill in the Assembly. And so if you have 76 members sign on as sponsor legislation, it would require that bill to come to the floor for debate.
Right.
Just have the discussion and then cast a vote on it.
Right.
That's not the way it is right. Let's go and take a look at the remarks that Mark Johns made at this press conference. We'll be coming right back to talk more on today's Assembly calendar.
The New York State Assembly is the equivalent of the House of Representatives in Washington. In Washington, you need 218 members to vote yes on a bill to pass a bill. If you have 218 signatories to a bill in Washington, you can do something that's known as a discharge petition. That means you can force that bill to the floor. As Jimmy says, force it to the floor, not guarantee that it's going to pass. And you get a debate, a discussion, and an up or down vote. A lot of bills in Washington do come up to the floor. The The House of Representatives is Republican, but they don't always have 218 votes. They do bring bills to the floor. A few years ago, they brought a bill called the Violence Against Women's Act, VAWA. A lot of you may know what it is. They didn't have enough Republican votes to pass it. They brought it to the floor anyway, and the Democrats, the majority voted with them, and the bill was passed. That's all Jimmy and all of us are asking to be allowed to happen down here. Unfortunately, every bill that comes to the floor does pass, but keep in mind, 90% of the legislation that we author down here, we author more bills than the House of Representatives in Washington, and 90% of the legislation we author never comes up for a vote. This will help rectify that.
You and I both know numerous bills that it sounds like the people in New York State would really go for,
Sure.
but they never come to the floor of the Assembly for whatever reason. And there could be numerous reasons. And I wouldn't even want to begin to guess what the reason might be, that the Speaker says, no, not going to happen. And he's got that much control here right now. That's, I guess, part of the problem that you're talking about.
Right. Well, you know what? We could save the state a whole lot of money if we just had one governor, one majority leader in the Senate, and one speaker. Just have 3 men in a room for every deal out there, because that's how we do the budgets. And any major piece of legislation is decided by 3 men, and then the majorities, which really have no power, just get in line and vote yes. And that's unfortunate. But the kind of things that people would like to see, redistricting reform, real campaign finance reform, most importantly, term limits, these are all things that if you look at the latest polls, 80 to 90% of the people will come to the poll and vote on. But we're not even giving the voters an option to come out and vote on these bills. Now, if we're not willing to take them up ourselves on the floor of the legislature, I believe that we should have a referendum so that voters in this state go out and get 50,000 signatures for any one of our bills and then bring it up for a vote. I mean, we let the public vote on gambling casinos. They got 52%. Back in Monroe County, where I'm from, Monroe County actually voted down casino gambling. So if we're letting people vote on casino gambling, paperless legislature, other referendums that we let come up for a vote, let's bring up term limits. Why would the Democrats in the Assembly block something that's the most popular idea in the state? And let's face
because it doesn't benefit them. I mean,
that's exactly right.
You know,
yeah, it doesn't benefit them. But as I said earlier, we're not supposed to be down here to benefit ourselves. We're supposed to be down here to doing the work of the people. And we say we're the house of the people and we're the party of the people and we do the people's work, the people's business. Well, if the people want term limits and real reform, let's start doing it. Check the boxes right down the line.
You can only do the people's work or the people's business if the work comes before you in the Assembly chamber. And that's that's the clip that we just watched there a minute ago. If you have more than 76 sponsors, those bills would come. You just talked about another way to get those bills onto the floor, having the people take up the gauntlet and and do the signatures and the petitions and get the. There's another way too, and you've been talking about this ever since you got to Albany. You've called it a number of different things. The SOL Act.
Oh, the SOL Act.
And you brought it up at the beginning of this session as a rules change, allowing legislators to bring any bill they sponsor, particular piece of legislation, to the floor for a vote. Let's go back and take a look at that when you proposed it on the floor of the Assembly chamber.
Let's let every member bring a signature piece of legislation once every 2 years. You can't ask for the less. You know, Mr. Speaker, a couple years ago, this chamber passed the Women's Equality Agenda, and members of the majority party pointed their fingers down the hall to the Senate and said, why doesn't the Senate bring that bill up? Now, would that bill have passed the Senate? We don't know. It would have been a close vote either way, right? But if we in the State Assembly don't believe in legislative equality, don't believe that a member should have one opportunity every 2 years to bring a bill forward for a debate, a discussion, or an up or down vote, it's very hard for us to tell the chamber down the hall that they ought to be doing the same. Two-thirds of the votes, two-thirds of the bills that we pass in the Assembly never come up for a vote in the Senate. And it takes two parts of the legislature to actually pass a bill and have the governor sign it into law. So what I'm asking for is an opportunity for everybody to bring one piece of legislation, if they so choose, once every 2 years, and let's have a debate and a discussion and an up or down vote. on the issues that mean something to the people back home.
You know, I've heard the phrase in Washington called the Washington bubble, and I tend to think sometimes there's an Albany bubble, and I wonder if the people watching this program right now, what they really think of this. It probably seems like a lot of inside baseball to them, and bringing bills to the floor and getting ideas and here and there. But this is what led to, again, going back to the beginning of this program, the conviction of 2 legislative leaders. I mean, this is unheard of. And if nothing's going to grab the attention and the ideas of the people that are watching, I don't know what else will. But there's got to be a shakeup. There's got to be a change and an openness of the process. That's what I think. That's what we're missing in what is truly supposed to be a democratic political process.
Right. Well, you know what? We talk about fairness. We talk about equality. We talk about marriage equality and pay equality. What about legislative equality? Why don't we let every member bring a bill up? Most people say, well, I didn't know you couldn't bring a bill up. Well, even the Democrat majority can't bring a bill up unless the Speaker okays it. And when the bill comes to the floor, it always passes. We haven't had a bill come to the floor and fail in decades. So if that doesn't tell you that it's a done deal, the deals are all cut in advance. And I'm saying let's introduce a couple of wild cards now and then. Let's bring up term limits and the other reforms that folks want. Isn't it amazing? The term limits, I think in the latest Siena poll, was at 82%. After these convictions of the 2 leaders down here, it's probably 90%. We don't allow people to vote on something that they really feel a passion about, but yet we're going to vote on a lot of other things, as I said, gambling casinos, which lost in my district.
You know, a lot of people have differing opinions and strong opinions on mixed martial arts, but to prove your point, the number 2 Democrat in the Assembly, the majority leader, the guy who runs the floor for the Speaker, he's had a bill for years on MMA and whether or not it would be sanctioned. New York State would allow sanctioned MMA matches. Even he couldn't get the number 2 Democrat for whatever reason. Again, and I wouldn't want to speculate on what the reasons might be behind the scenes, unions or labor issues, whatever it might be. The number 2 guy couldn't get a bill to the floor of the House because apparently the Speaker had some kind of issue with it, even though apparently it looks like whatever the issue was has been resolved because we may see that bill this week.
Well, it looks like that bill is going to pass, and that's been 6 years in the waiting. And look at the hundreds of millions of dollars that we've lost in New York State. Revenue for Rochester, Buffalo, New York City, Madison Square Garden. Whether you're for or against something, you know what? If you don't like a piece of legislation, the red button works. I use it now and then. So if you don't like something that's coming up, then vote against it. Explain your vote. But what I don't see is the folks up here ever having to explain their vote as to why they don't allow term limits and real reform to come to the floor for discussion and an up or down vote.
One last thing, and I've got less than a minute to do it, is pension forfeiture. The Assembly Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader, the first thing they did practically after the jury foreman read the words guilty was sign up for their pension, and they're going to be getting very big pensions all the time that they're in prison.
They're going to be getting $90,000 a year in prison, and I understand when you're in prison, your food, clothing, and shelter is paid for, so they're going to get a nice lump sum when they come out of prison, and that's pretty disgraceful, really. And the Assembly Republican minority has been advocating for years to get pension forfeiture for corrupt politicians.
If you commit those crimes in the course of your duties, what you're elected to do. Mark Johns, always a pleasure to see you. Thanks for stopping by today. We'll see you next time soon.
We'll be back. Yes.
All right, and we want to thank you folks, too, for dropping by and spending your time. We'll hope to see you soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.